In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. I believe we are online, and we are going to do the Ladder of Divine Ascent, steps 4 and 5 today. Daniel Costandi was supposed to be the one to do this, and that's okay that he's not able to because he got stuck in some wild traffic. And so I'm going to try and pick up the pace or try to talk about things myself. I am sorry if there is some technical difficulty here. Hopefully you guys are hearing me. If for any reason, because I'm on an iPad, I'm not on my normal computer, I can't get messages. I don't see any messages. I don't see anything. So just text me on my phone if there's something that is going down that I need to switch gears on. Okay, so let's start with first 3 steps that we had talked about last week were renunciation of life, which is basically, because it's a monastic text, moving away from living in the world, detachment, and exile. Then he picks up and he starts talking about this amazing chapter on obedience. Obedience, he'll talk a little bit about the idea of obedience, but also talk about the importance of a spiritual father, which I remember now when I read this, how important it was for me in my own relationship with my spiritual father, how I felt nourished. I felt that this was super important. So what I'll do is I will go over the notes that Daniel made on these on this PDF and PowerPoint, and then what I'll do is I will go through my own reading, my own notes that I have written down. So he says, voluntary obedience is voluntary renunciation of one's own will and the preference of another's will, surrendering to God himself or another person. Obedience should not be misunderstood as an act of weakness, not merely submission. Rather, acts of obedience is an act of strength, classifying one as a warrior and athlete of Christ. A truly obedient person follows the instruction of a trusted spiritual leader without hesitation or the undue interference of that person's own will. And that's really where the heart of this will be, is his emphasis, and this is important for the spiritual father to understand this as well, because when the obedient person is obedient with the spiritual father, essentially what St. John Climacus is arguing is that the obedient person will no longer be judged, but the spiritual father will be judged. And we can talk about that in a little bit. So welcoming a criticism or an examination and complying with the examination in a bilateral or symbiotic way ensures that the obedience is effective and efficient. And he talks a lot about just dealing with unjust criticism or difficult tasks that the spiritual father places on the person. St. John uses languages of strength, not weakness. Uses the mortification of the members, noble fighter, death freely accepted, danger faced without worry. There's some other things there that are getting cut off. This is only giving it to me as a PDF, unfortunately. When he talks about death freely accepted, no fear of bodily death. Danger faced without fear, courage, and the freedom to enforce the truth. Fear was diagnosed as faithlessness by Christ. Acting on one's own behalf, this living corpse grows sick at heart, as personal judgment can be a burden. And then Christ's yoke, relinquishing your burdens to another, which is the spiritual father, which creates this symbiosis. And then submission, overcoming pride, purification, unshackling from passions, true freedom. By submission, you commute your sentence. Persistence, the Lord has tried them like gold in a furnace, and he has received purification. I'm going to, I'll just read this other one and then we're going to go into the actual texts. Uh, Doing it halfway will probably make you more miserable than you were before. St. John calls the road short and rough. He also says that it's like putting medicine in your eye, but also quicklime. Like basically, you are, he's like, if you do it halfway, it's like putting medicine and quicklime alternatively. And you got to essentially pick one or the other. Do not, and you have to, when you're getting in a relationship with a spiritual father, do not mistake who the sailor is and who the helmsman is, who the patient is and who the doctor is, which one is the sea and which one is the harbor. St. John says you have to put your spiritual father on a pedestal in your heart and mind as best as you can. Dwell on the good. This will help you to listen and to obey. Submit to him like iron to a blacksmith. The sword doesn't talk back when it's being pounded. It doesn't question, it doesn't flail. Own the sins, communicate them as spiritual infractions, not as concepts. This is my wound, this is my injury, and it happened because of my negligence. This part here, and I see you have discussion points there, but we are going to kind of spend some time on obedience because there were, from my perspective, I think there was a lot of things that spoke to me specifically. And this is an excellent read. I finished it in one sitting today, and I'm not usually able to do that. So he's right when he says obedience is the total renunciation of your own life. And in the monastic concept, the idea is I go to a monastery. Excuse me. I go to a monastery and I submit 100% to the spiritual father of that monastery. Tells me to stand for an hour, I stand for an hour. Tells me to go water a stick, which we know the story of St. John the Short, I go water a stick. He tells me to carry meat in a basket from the village to the monastery, and I'm getting eaten by birds. I do that anyway. So what is the goal and what is the purpose? It is so that I bury my own will and I resurrect with humility. Spiritual father, I don't care about whether the spiritual father is good or bad. I say the spiritual father who has devotedly put the disciple's soul to death will answer for everything. And that's now the idea in the monastery, where I go and the spiritual father will be, I replace my will with his will. And in essence, I'm replacing my will with the Father's will, with God's will. He goes and he has a bunch of crazy stories that we might hit on a couple of them here. But how can we apply this in our own personal life here in my own situation? So there are at least 2 or 3 ways that I have to do it. 1, I have to have a spiritual father. That's number 1. 2, I read my Bible and I read spiritual books and I try to understand what God is asking of me through my spiritual father and my reading of scripture. Number 3 is I can also accept my parents as a spiritual guide, and I completely submit to them as if submitting to God. My spouse, even sometimes my children to some extent. And I'll tell you where this really comes into play. There are definitely parents out there where the kids are like, I want to fast. And the parents are like, well, not this early, whatever. Like the parents should comply with these orders. I know it sounds crazy, but we're talking about when it comes to spirituality. The kid says, I want to go to church early tomorrow. Parents should do their best to bring the kids early to church tomorrow. The kids, want to do something spiritual or want to go to the monastery, whatever. Like these are the places where we listen to the voice of God and say, okay, I should be in obedience not just to my body, because the opposite is my own will, my own desires. And more often than not, my own will and desires, even in a monastery, like that talks about how um, spiritually in a monastery, if I don't submit 100% to the spiritual father, I could find myself um, not making any headway. The idea of living as a corpse is also something that is oftentimes repeated in the spiritual in the spiritual life. Like you just have to be dead to the world and dead to yourself. And then he says the blessed living corpse. He's talking about the person who has given themselves over. So they're a living corpse, basically dead but living. Grows sick at heart when he finds himself acting on his own behalf and is frightened by the burden of using his own personal judgment. Frightened by the burden of using, like basically the person's like, well, okay, if you are going to decide about some spiritual practice or some spiritual idea or anything related to the spiritual life, you should be frightened by the idea of taking your own personal judgment as your guide. Essentially, you need a spiritual father who will guide you, because when you take your own spiritual guidance, other fathers have said, you've chosen a fool when you take your own spiritual guidance as how you're going to do things. So when it comes to fasting, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to going to church, when it comes to service, when it comes to how much to read in the Bible, all of that stuff, when I decide myself, this is enough, or even sometimes I can go overboard and say, I'm going to read 10 chapters in the Bible, and the priest would be like, no, just try to read 1 or 2 or 3 and apply them in your life, as opposed to just consuming. Better to read and to do than to just read to say I've read. And he talks about this, I'm pretty sure is in this section, where people will pray not because they're trying to draw closer to God, but because they want to be known as no, this is a Pope Shenouda book that I was reading. But the idea is, I'm going to pray a lot just so I could be known as a person of prayer, as opposed to desiring to be closer to God. Obedience brings us closer to God. And it was right what Daniel Costandi put here, where he says we have to know the difference between who's the sailor and who's the helmsman. Even if we should notice faults in our spiritual father, after all, says he is human. And if we should start making judgments, then our submissiveness will earn us no profit, and we'll find ourselves becoming the judge as opposed to the one who is being judged. And when the thought strikes you to judge or condemn your superior, leap away as though from fornication. Give no trust, place, entry, or starting point to that snake. And this is essentially important for us, because when we discover something that we don't like about our spiritual father, it tends to be something where we're like, okay, I'm not going to talk to this guy anymore. I'm not going to show them my weakness, and I'm not going to put myself in front of this person. And then what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I'm going to go find another spiritual father. But then when I find another spiritual father, I realize that person also has mistakes, that person also has problems. And then I'll continue to jump until eventually I have no spiritual father. The spiritual fathers, in the desert, if they did not have a spiritual father, they said, I'd rather become the disciple of my disciple than to take my own self as my spiritual father. Going on, and I'm in my section of the book, and using the one from Paulus Press, I'm on page 93. He says, above all, let us make our confession to our good judge and to him alone, though to all if he so commands. So he's saying, make your confession to your spiritual father, but if I have to make it to all, only if he commands. Wounds shown in public will not grow worse, but will be healed. This is back in the day when there was public confession. And there was a story about a man who was a thief, but was very eager to become a monk. So the spiritual father says, you can become a monk on one condition. You come and you confess yourself, your sins to the entire assembly. So he came to the assembly, and the spiritual father, the superior, stood at the door of the altar and shouted and said, "You are not worthy to come in here. Stop! You are not worthy to come in here." And so he stopped. He prostrated and he confessed all of his sins. And they were horrifying. He says the author, St. John Climacus, says, I can't even write the stuff that he confessed. He says everyone was horrified, but when he had finished his confession, the superior allowed him to be given the habit at once and to be included with the ranks of the brethren. Basically, he didn't have to spend a year or two or several years. He had gone so far in his spiritual life because of this obedience that he was given the ability to become a monk right away. Another thing he writes about, and this amazes me. He says, sometimes public confession is important. And he says, first off, once the person has confessed and has been shamed, it is all gone. It's all there. And that he says something very interesting later on. He says, shame heals shame. Yeah, on page 108, only through shame can you be freed from shame. Now, there's a shame that we feel with God with our sins. And that is, oh, shoot, did I lose everybody? Are we still here? Hopefully.
We can hear you, but we can't see anything.
Okay, 8, 9, 10. Hopefully, screen is being shared still. Doesn't look like it. Let me see 1 second.
There we go. We see you.
Let me share the screen one more time. And all right, so at the very least, actually, you know what? I'm going to stop sharing the screen just so that we can, you guys, hopefully it'll stay on this way. What I was going to say is, when it comes to shame, there's been a lot written about shame, how bad it is. And that we live in a shame culture. This is written by a famous author, Brene Brown. It's good. They're good reads. She talks about shame and how so much of what we do is driven by shame. And she's trying to push us away from feeling shame, which in some contexts is good, but she's also trying to get us to, what's the word? Maybe not use it to our advantage. And also there's a lot of this, like, it's don't shame anyone, and it's not right to be shaming anyone. So there's a lot there that I don't want to get into right now, but I think in this context, if we can go back to the 4th century, or this is, I think maybe the 7th or 9th even, but this we have to admit and understand that we carry shame in ourselves when we commit sin. And that shame oftentimes might lead us to doing other bad things. So like, I feel shame, so I don't want to go to church. I feel shame, I don't want to pray. I feel shame, I don't want to go do service. I feel shame and I continue to do the same acts just so that, because they promised me, the temptation is that you're going to feel better if you do these things. Shaming can lead to eating. Shaming can lead to other sins. But when I have this shame in front of me, what he is saying and what organizations like AA kind of are using, as well as just the other day when I was talking about Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, going into the middle of the town and confessing your sin. The shame of confession will free me from the shame of the sin. And that is so essential on so many levels, that people keep carrying the shame, but it gets muddled. They don't see it as shame. It's not like they don't feel like they're comparing, they're feeling the shame of sin. What they feel like they're feeling is anger towards other people, or anger towards other issues. And oftentimes this guy is not off. He talks about this. Oftentimes it can be anger towards my spiritual father, or anger towards God, or anger towards the church, when in fact it is a shame that just needs to be relinquished and confessed. And this is for us what he gets at when he's talking about obedience. If someone, and he moves on, he kind of goes from he says, so I can get rid of that shame. The second reason he says is that sometimes there are other people that have unconfessed sins. So whenever there's a public confession, it's so that other people can be encouraged to confess their sins. He goes on to 95. He says that when St. John Climacus was observing the spiritual father, and he says, an unbreakable bond of love joined these men together, and more wonderful was their freedom from all familiarity and idle chatter. Above all, they strove never to injure a brother's conscience, and if ever someone showed hatred to another, the shepherd, the pastor, the priest, the abbot, the shepherd banished him like a convict to the isolation monastery. Why? Once, when a brother spoke ill of a neighbor, the holy man, on hearing him, had him expelled immediately. He says, I am not having a visible devil here along with the invisible one. And what's amazing is that the one who's banished is still being obedient to the spiritual father. And they speak about this. They speak about this this one monastery called the Prison, which I don't expect us to be comfortable with, because it's like, and I think in another section he talks a lot about it, but it's for another time and another place. I am seeing, by the way, I am seeing in the chat on Zoom, I can see questions. So if there is anybody that has a question, feel free to place it. I'm going to kind of go forward with a little bit more. He does talk about an individual called Isidore. There's a bunch of places, and but the level of obedience there is just unbelievable. There's this one a story where there's this like abbot who, to show the obedience of another man who was like 80 years old, called this man, and this man did like an embarrassment. Sorry, he did a prostration, and he waited for the abbot to tell him what to do, and and so the abbot didn't tell him anything, had him stay there for an hour, and then told him to go out to somebody else, to another individual, and to pray Psalm 40 or Psalm 39. I patiently waited for the Lord, right? Ironic psalm, but also appropriate. Then St. John, who wrote this book, goes out and says, what were you thinking about when the abbot left you there? He said, I thought of the shepherd as the image of Christ, and that while I was at the table, I prayed as if I was at the altar of God, rather than at the table of men. And because I trust and I love my shepherd, I had no bad thoughts concerning him. I trust and love him. It is said that love does not reckon up injury, and that's what I did. And that's why I was able to stay away from any attack of the devil, and to trust in the shepherd. And I thought, how far are we from that attitude. And I'm talking about even just myself, like our metropolitan, we have a priest meeting tomorrow. Um, sometimes I'm eager to go to these priest meetings, sometimes just dragging my feet, and sometimes I'm not able to go for whatever reason. But I should have that obedience to when he calls, I answer, I come. And there's a beautiful story in the, and I've said this many times before, but I love this story about an abbot who was told, um, um, an abbot who was told that, an abbot was accused by his monks. So the abbot is the head of the monastery, accused by his monks of favoring one over the other. So the other abbots from other monasteries came to judge him, and he said, "Okay, but let me show you something." And so he says, he went through every door and he knocked on every door. He says, "Brother, come here. I need you for something." And the brother or the monk would say, "Okay." They would say, "Okay, I'm coming," but they wouldn't come. Then he gets to the one he's being accused of favoritism for. He knocks on the door and he says, "Brother, come. I need you for something." So he comes immediately, answers the door. "Yes, Father." He's go, do X, Y, and Z. And so he sends him far off. And then he tells the other abbots, "Let's go and look to see what he was doing." So he's a calligrapher. And they looked to see his writing of a manuscript. And they said, "Look what he was doing. He was halfway through a letter and he didn't even stop to finish the letter. He didn't continue to finish. He stopped right away and answered the door and went on a task." He says, "Now you can judge me." He says, "Okay, we understand." We understand. But obedience is something that it creates a bond of love and a bond of trust, and it's quite beautiful. So there's a question. One of the slides had the verse about "My yoke is easy, sweet, and burden is light." In the first chapter, John says, "All who enter upon the good fight, which is hard and narrow, but also easy." What does easy mean? Is it related to obedience and straightforwardness? I think in a way, that's a good question. We'll get to this I think, I'm not sure if it's in this chapter that you're referring to, or if it's from one of the slides that Danny Costandi had on. But I think you're on the right point. When easy means I don't have to decide anything. I just follow what my spiritual father tells me to do. And it's really hard later on in life, because later on in life, what ends up happening is I think I know more. And so you get older, and the spiritual fathers that you have or have had have passed away. And what you end up finding is that you have to rely on younger spiritual fathers. But if you're able to humble yourself and say, "Okay, I'm going to listen," and by that age, you're not really, there's not really going to be that much that you're going to have to be quote unquote obedient about. There's going to be still a level of obedience, like as your age, as you get older. And let's say, like I was speaking with an elderly person today, and she is diabetic, but she doesn't want to eat before communion. She wants to still maintain the Eucharistic fast. Her body doesn't allow her to. So the church gives permission to those whose health does not allow them to fast to have something small to eat, but it's not something that they're able to accept easily. As children, think about it. A child, you tell them to eat, they'll say, "Okay, no problem." Don't eat. Oh, okay, all right. It's harder, but they're able to follow. So I think the easy part of this, if I remember correctly, in that opening chapter, was about both. It's both easy because the yoke of Christ is sweet. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light." But it is a yoke. But I'm being yoked, because yoke is two oxen being yoked together. I'm being yoked with Christ. So he's the one that's also carrying with me as well. Going on page 99, the end, he says, 3 things happen that are very wrong. First, if the director, the spiritual father, misses the rewards due to him for making corrections. So basically it says three things are wrong. If a spiritual father does not make a correction, he loses his reward. Second, the director fails to bring profit to others when he could have done so through the virtue of that one person. And that might be whether it is encouraging somebody to virtue. So like, let's say somebody is especially obedient or someone's especially humble. To give them the reward of that humility or that reward of that obedience is to give them more things, more tasks to do. Number three, and this is the worst, he says, is that those who seem to be the most hardworking and obedient, and hence confirmed in virtue, if left for any length of time without being censured or reproached by the superior, lose their meekness and obedience they formerly had. Good, fruitful, and fertile land, if left without the water of dishonor, are you hearing this? Can revert to being forest and can produce the thorns of vanity, cowardice, and arrogance. The great apostle understood this. Hence his instruction to Timothy, be insistent, criticize them, rebuke in season and out of season. That's his translation. But what's interesting here is that from time to time, servants will come along in the church and will say, we should recognize the work and the good stuff that the servants are doing. We should kind of recognize either publicly or or just have some sort of an acknowledgement of the hard work that they've put in. St. John Climacus would say, absolutely not. What you should do is you should basically tell them that they are unprofitable servants, only doing that which was required of them, and that we should not, at all kind of give awards and recognition and all of that. That's St. John Climacus for sure, if not worse. The idea that there should be some sort of recognition, especially from this quote, would be destroyed completely. But also the underlying idea is that we're doing things out of obedience to God and service to God. There was another a thought that I wanted to present on this issue as well. Not only should we not seek recognition, but we should serve in a way where what we're doing is not public. I know it's obvious when I'm, for me, serving liturgy, or for me doing other services, I'm out there serving, everybody sees me serving, but not to be, okay? Not to be praised for it. Like the worst thing that could happen is, someone saying, not the worst thing, but like anybody to kind of give credit. I remember what I was going to say. You either get your reward here or you get your reward in the kingdom of heaven. So if you get praised for it here, you will not be praised for it there. If you get rewarded for it here, that's it. Better to be not rewarded for it. He moves on and he says this, and this is also, I think, really important. But when I argued the matter with that true director, reminding him of human frailty, I suggested that punishment, deserved or otherwise, might lead many to break away from the flock. That man, the director, so St. John is talking about this director that he's having a conversation with, that man in whom wisdom had made a home had this to say to me: a soul that is bound in faith and love to the shepherd for Christ's sake does not go away even when blood is spilt. He certainly does not leave if through the shepherd he has received the cure for his wounds, for he bears in mind the words, neither angels nor principalities nor powers nor any other creature can separate us from the love of Christ. If a soul is not attached, bound, and devoted to the shepherd in this fashion, it seems to me that the man should not be here at all. For what binds him to the shepherd is hypocrisy and false obedience. And the truth is that this great man is not deceived, for he has guided, led to perfection, and offered to Christ blameless sacrifices. So on one level, the spiritual father is super important. On another level, and we should always pray and ask God for a spiritual father. And I want to say that, I heard this once from a priest here, and I've read it several times in this particular chapter, that we essentially can make our spiritual father into a prophet. Why? If I pray to God and I say, God, you give me something to hear, or something to learn, or something to take away from this particular spiritual father, give me a word that I can take, and I can understand, that I can grow closer to you. And he will give that to you. And he will give that to you. God will give that to you. And my spiritual father said this also. He's a very, can be a very, kind of straight to the point kind of a guy. He said, if someone joins the church and then leaves, they were never really part of the church to begin with. If they were really part of the church, and this is what he's saying, that nothing can separate me from the love of Christ. If they were really part of the church, they would do everything to stay in the church. Even if I did something wrong, he's talking about himself, even if I taught a heresy, but they really love God and the church and care about their spiritual life, then my mistakes should not affect anything. If it does, then their relationship is with me and not with God. You see this? Like, some people love to take it upon themselves to announce, oh, this priest said X, Y, and Z. This priest did something. I'm leaving the church out of protest. Right? But if we understand what the church is and what Christ is, and separating ourselves from Christ, we would not be so eager to create such a protest. It's the idea of cutting your nose off to spite your face, which is the saying. If you're angry at something, you have to count the cost of what you're doing, but understand also the great benefit you could receive, even from a poor spiritual father, which he talks about at some point in this chapter. The idea of excuse me, of a spiritual father who, because that spiritual father was so lousy, the disciple became such a great saint, to the extent that when the spiritual father lost that disciple and went to another spiritual father, says, my disciple is dead. He said, no, your disciple's not dead. He said, no, he's buried. Let's go. So he goes to the tomb, and he says to the disciple, I forget what the disciple's name was, like Abba something, Abacus or something. He says, Abacus, are you dead? He says, no, I'm not dead. Even though he's dead, he's alive. He's the idea is that he was alive. It was a funny story, but it was showing the holiness of the ascetic, and the virtue one can receive. And there's another saying of the Desert Father about obedience. There was 3 monks who went to a spiritual father, and each of those 3 monks was showing the virtue of the other. So the one says, this guy fasts for many long hours. And the other said, okay, this guy over here, he visits the sick all around. Wherever he can go, he visits the sick and does this tirelessly. And the third one, they said, well, this guy, he's been a disciple for the same master for the last 20 years. And the spiritual father says, this last one is the one who's the greatest among you, the one who is the disciple of the... He says, for the one who has fasted and the one who has visited the sick has done what it was their will to do. But the third one has replaced his will with the master's will. Has replaced his will by being a disciple of the master. He's replaced his will with the master's will. And he says, of this kind, this is the kind that martyrs are made. Martyrs who are willing to witness and die, because anyone who's been even just you working in a situation, working in a what you call a toxic environment, or working for, or serving in a church where everything's just kind of upside down, we struggle in those situations and not say, I'm being defeated by everyone around me. I can't do this anymore. I'm going to go serve someplace that's a lot easier, or even where I'm not serving anymore. I'm going to go and do my own thing. And we feel like our time, which is so precious, is wasted on these attempts to serve. And we don't realize that we are being formed and our obedience is being really refined, and our humility is growing. Remember how I told you, I think this was last year, or maybe in the last meeting, or even in the servants meeting that we had on Sunday, he gives these pedigrees of what leads to what leads to what. Obedience leads to humility, leads to dispassion. Obedience leads to humility. So how can I become humble? By being obedient. Obedient to whatever. You say to yourself, like, let's say if you're living at home and in this situation that you're in, you say, God, I want to learn obedience today, but don't announce this to other people, because you don't want to get manipulated and abused. Say to yourself, today, I'm going to do, with your strength and your power, God, I want to become obedient. I'm going to do everything that's reasonable, everything that somebody asks me to do today. Right? So I'm at home and your brother asks you to get you a cup of water, to get a cup of water. Say, sure, I'm going to get you. Your sister needs a ride someplace. Your father asks you to do something. Your mother needs, whatever it is. God, I'm all yours today. But don't say it like, I'm going to do this. This is what I want to do myself. Say, no, God, I'm going to be obedient to you today. Whatever happens, happens. Or before I go into my confession, say to God, whatever He tells me to do, let me do. Help me to do. And there are so many funny stories that can come out of confession. This one guy, this one priest. Basically, there are stories. I don't want to. Yeah, we only have a few more minutes. I want to get through this. Where the spiritual father totally sees through the person's confession and gives them what they need to do, even though they didn't really confess everything that they were supposed to confess. This comes through prayer and through a heart open for this. So I'm just kind of going through stuff, and I know that Daniel was going to be able to do this much better. Here, he goes on again, bottom of 103. Your tongue longs to jump into an argument, restrain it. This is about obedience, right? So you're going to pull your body into obedience. It is a tyrant, your tongue, and you must fight it daily, 70 times 7. Fix your mind to your soul as to the wood of a cross. Strike it with alternating hammer blows like an anvil. So he's talking about your mind to your soul as to the wood of the cross. Remember, the soul is kind of the driver, and the mind has to be occupied with what is good for the soul. And so the mind needs to be brought to blows like iron on an anvil. It has to be mocked, abused, ridiculed, and wronged, though without in any way being crushed or broken. Indeed, it must be kept calm and unstirred. Shed your will as if it were some disgraceful garment, and having thus stripped yourself of it, go into the practice arena. Put on the breastplate of faith. He's saying, go practice arena is let your spiritual father be your guide. The breastplate of faith is faith in God and faith in this individual, which is so hard to come by. Put on the breastplate of faith, which is so hard to come by, and let it not be crushed or damaged by distrust of your trainer. Let the rein of temperance curb the shameless onward leap of the sense of touch. Let with meditation on death bridle those eyes, so ready to waste endless hours in the contemplation of physical beauty. This guy is talking, he's like, this is pre-internet, right? Pre-social media, pre any of this nonsense. He says, with meditation on death, bridle your eyes. Hold back your mind. Show instead every love and sympathy for your neighbor. Dearest Father, all men will come to know that we are disciples of Christ if, as we live together, we have love for one another. Says if you're going to be, he talks a little bit further. He says that this is on 104. The blessed pastor noticed that some continued to talk while the rest of us were standing in prayer. This is something interesting. He says in church. And he made them stand in front of the church for a whole week. And they had to make a prostration before everyone going in and out. So imagine the priest says to you, you were talking during prayer, stand out in the back for the next week and give prostrations for everyone coming in and out. And what was even more surprising, he did it to people of clerical rank, basically priests among the monks. As you stand outside and give a matanya for everyone coming in because of what you did. Like, it's a different world. I would love to be able to do that. On 105, he says, it is a good thing to admire the labors of holy men. To imitate them procures salvation. But it is unreasonable and impossible to wish to imitate on a sudden whim every aspect of the way they live. So when you see holy people and we're reading books like this, don't think like you're going to be able to imitate it right away. There's no way. It says, take your time, learn things, because you're gonna have to be told, sometimes rebuked. You have to accept criticism. You have to accept that you don't know everything. You have to accept that things are maybe not as you see them. And sometimes, like, there's this one monk who said, I went to the monastery, and in my room before I went to the monastery, I was doing 100 matanyas. And then when I went to the monastery, the abbot told me to do 15. And so I ended up doing none. And I went to confession the first time. Asked me, how many of your prostrations did you do? He said, I did none. And he said, because doing 100 of your own will is easier than doing 15 by obedience. Right? So there are things where we have to be criticized, He's saying, like 15, I could do that standing on my head. What's 15? But to do it by obedience is different than by my own will. And elsewhere, there are people who are told by their spiritual father the number of words they are to say in the day, the number of sips of water they are to take in the day, the amount of food that they are able to take in the day. Now, especially for those of you that confess with me, don't even think that I'm going to care or be able to do that. That's something that I need to work on in my own spiritual life. But there are times where, sometimes I'm moved to say, for example, during Lent, stay away from social media completely, right? You should be able to accept that, and that it does become a sin for those who decide to not take that into consideration. Now he says something beautiful about the spiritual father. He says, one who is obedient to a spiritual father, And he calls this person a wisely obedient man. And of course, he's just talking to men, so that's why he's talking about men, women. Even if he, this man, was able to raise the dead, had the gift of tears, was free from conflict, will nevertheless say that this happened through the prayers of his spiritual father. So any gift that you have in your spiritual life, say, this is through my spiritual father. And I've said this before. St. John says it here that it is better to anger God than to anger your spiritual father. Because angering God, you have your spiritual father to intercede on your behalf. But if you anger your spiritual father, you don't have him. He's no longer interceding for you. And he says, really, it is one and the same. It is one and the same, angering God and angering your spiritual father. Unfortunately, for us, we don't necessarily look at obedience, first off, as that important of a virtue, and the spiritual father as that important of a person to fall in line with. And then he speaks about those who destroy the work of a spiritual father. So let's say, John has a spiritual father, and Simon goes to him and says, your spiritual father is not that great. You shouldn't listen to him. He says, this person, he who deprives a blind man of his guide, so Simon telling John who's blind, don't go with your guide. So he deprives a blind man of his guide, or a flock of its shepherd, a lost man of his counselor, a child of his father, a sick man of his doctor, a ship of its pilot. This person becomes a menace to everyone. And he who tries to fight unaided against the spirits gets himself killed by them. You can't be in the church without a spiritual father. And you must make sure that you don't put down anyone's spiritual father or deprive them of them. We ought to be careful to keep a watch on ourselves. When a harbor is full of ships, it's easy to run into each other. So we have to also understand that in a group, in a community, we have to just keep an eye on ourselves and make sure that we're not bumping into anyone else or causing anyone else harm. Yeah. So keep going. We're on page 112. Fight always with your thoughts and call them back when they wander away. So again, this is about obedience and the mind having to be obedient. God does not demand of those under obedience that their thoughts be totally undistracted when they pray. How many of us get distracted when we pray? Yeah. It's okay. What we have to do is we don't lose heart, but we remain calm and we constantly call our mind back. Constantly call. Could be 5, 6, 7 times. And during prayer, it's easy to do this by just remembering the words or coming back to the words. My personal prayer, if I pray something that I don't remember what I prayed, I repeat it. Is it longer? Yes, but it's also telling the devil and telling myself, I'm not going to leave these words until I finish this prayer. I might say that Our Father 3 times before I actually am focused and concentrated on it. Regarding those who have undertaken to care for us in the Lord, we should trust them completely, even when they order us to do something that looks like being contrary to our salvation. That is the time when our faith in them is tested in a furnace of humiliation. And the sign of the most genuine faith is when we obey our superiors without hesitation, even when we see the opposite happening to what we had hoped. I remember this, and I learned a big lesson. There were 2 priests. They both have the same name. I'm not going to say which. We were in the church of the one priest. We were in the church of the one priest. We'll call him Abuna Mike, or Abuna, we'll call him Barsanofius. Abuna Barsanofius, we were in his church. And there was another Abuna Barsanofius in a very, very far church. Sayyidina was in his room, and um, and somebody came in with a phone and said, Abuna Barsanofis wants to talk to you, Sayyidina. And Sayyidina said, well, tell him to come. So the guy said, okay, Abuna Barsanofis, come. 2 hours later, Abuna Barsanofis walks through us, and Sayyidina's like, Huenta, you're the Abuna Barsanofis that was on the phone? He says, yes, Sayyidina. And Sayyidina realized, and I thought it was the Abuna Barsanofis for here. But this priest, in complete obedience, drove 2 hours, sat with Sayyidina, finished up, and then went back. This is beautiful. Would I have done that? Probably not. But it's not because of my lack of obedience. It's like, I'll tell him when I tell him. Only the devil is the only person that cannot act contrary to his own will. So if I am also unable to act contrary to my own will, I have aligned myself with the devil. If there is a temptation on us to move from place to place, like he says, or to do something in our life that would be pleasing to God, we have to understand, like when we think about, I could do X, Y, and Z. I can, if I wasn't teaching kindergarten, if I was teaching high school, I could do so much more. If in high school, if I wasn't teaching high school, if I was teaching college, or if I was able to do the homeless ministry, or if I was able to, do something else. Whenever I'm being tempted in a different direction, it's my own will, and we have to understand this is a war that's coming on against us. And a war comes on against us when we're making war, right? So when you're in your service or in your spiritual life, and you feel because you're doing the will of the obedience of your spiritual father, and war is kind of coming against you, realize that you're doing war, either with the devils that are around you, with yourself, or in the spiritual life. So just because you're being told to do something by your spiritual father and it causes issues to happen with you, that means this is a good thing. This is how we have to understand ourselves fighting. Yeah.
In a situation like that, like service, where I'm not saying this is how I feel, I'll just use myself as an example. But like I teach preschool, and let's just say I really felt like I could be better in sixth grade or something. Would it, like, how do we, I guess, differentiate between like disobedience, but also just like I don't know if calling is the right word, like, or even just asking, like, if you place me in preschool, do I just go silently and do it, or should I mention, like, oh, maybe, like, how do you feel about me going to sixth grade? Like,
right. Well, I feel like discussions are all good, but ultimately at the end, if you're asked to do sixth or preschool and you're not quite interested in it, you say, okay, God, help me to do this out of obedience. Now, obedience only goes so far, right? If you just you're not able to balance it with your spiritual life, you're not able to, you feel like you're not really accomplishing anything, then you go back to the spiritual father. But you might find out that the spiritual father wants you to be in a place where you're not accomplishing anything, teach you humility, right? It might be that, maybe, or there's just nobody else, right? Or there could be various reasons. But I'll give you another example. A priest, before he becomes a priest, has to be called by the bishop, has to be called by the church, the people, and has to feel the calling himself. A lot of times the temptation is, I feel called to be a priest. And a lot of people around me are like, you'd be a good priest. But the bishop's not calling you, right? Or bishop is calling you, but the people don't want it. Or the bishop is calling me and I don't feel called. Or the people are pushing me and I don't feel called. And like, right? I can feel like me personally, I can feel like I could be really useful if I was, let's say the church is like a car, right? if I'm driving a Tesla. But I could really drive well if that Tesla was like a Maserati, or right. And I keep wishing that the church was a Maserati. It just isn't it. God has placed me in this place, in this location, right? I would be I would be awesome if I had, more money, right? Or I'd be, like whatever. I could have all of these imaginations, but God places you in a certain place. It's for us to accept it and to learn from it, because there are no closed doors for God. Right? There's just opens windows, opens pathways for us. So if I feel something is not working, like let's say I I um I wish that we had a stronger Bible study here at the church. It's definitely something I wish for. What do we do? How do we get there? It's something I'm always kind of thinking about and trying to push and stuff. Sometimes it's just like this is just the best that we can do, right? And this is all that God is opening the door for, which is fine. I wish sometimes I could pray like weekly liturgies, but there's just limitations on the congregation, limitation on myself too. So I take that as being obedient to the situation that I'm in. Sometimes it's like a group project, right? I know in school this always used to frustrate people. Is you're the only like go-getter, and then there are three other losers on your team, and you end up doing all the work in order to get the grade. I decided I'm not doing all the work. We are going to be the best that we could possibly be, but as a group. So if the best we are is a C group, then that's it. It's like a team, right? Where the quarterback is awesome, but everybody else stinks, right? And the quarterback feels like, oh, I would be so good if I had a better team. No, this is the team that you got. This is the best that you could do on this team. This is it, right? There's no I in team, right? A couple more, one more thing. He says on 118, I have seen lovely children come to school for wisdom, education, and profit, and learn only cunning and vice through the contact they make with others. The wise man will understand what I'm saying. What am I saying? Sometimes we come together, and it's not for the better, it's for the worse. Like there's a group of people, and there might be a good couple of priests, but the group of people are not quite being obedient to the priest, but being obedient to themselves. It's like teenagers in high school, right? As opposed to learning and trying to be the best. I think for us, what we need to understand is that there is something called a bad apple, right? That can make the group rotten, right? And those types of situations can really become problematic in the church. I know the idea of a church is that everyone is welcome, all are welcome. Yeah, but all are welcome, but they have to follow the rules. They have to there has to be this obedience to the system that we have. Anyway, yeah, there's so much good in this, and I know we glossed over it. And while Daniel was not able to make it today, he is going to help us out with repentance for next week. And I know repentance or penitence is a bit of a long chapter, but with that penitence, I'm going to have somebody do remembrance of death, which is step 6, and step 7, which is mourning. If I remember those are pretty decent chapters. The remembrance of death is going to be something that's difficult. Remembrance of and on mourning, we're going to try to make it as practical as possible for our day and age. There's one question in the chat: how can obedience, which yields virtue, lead to discernment? That's my answer is kind of like a bit of an extrapolation from my own experience. When you're obedient to somebody, so let's say I want to go right, and I end up going left, and I live my life having gone left but either wondering what was wrong with right or wondering what could have been with right. Later on in life, I will see an experience where somebody went right, and I'll see the end result of that. Or I'll learn from my spiritual father why he told me left instead of right. And I'll learn from that example and be able to kind of not completely become, sorry, what's the word? I won't be someone who always needs someone to tell me to do, somebody to tell me what to do, but I'll be able to discern along the way later on. Keep in mind, spiritual father still has a spiritual father. So for me, things I spoke to my spiritual father about when I was 16 are not what I talk about now. And as a priest, I'm talking about things very specific to my service so that I can be obedient. So I'm obedient, and then I'm also learning how to direct people and kind of go forward. So it's about that experience that you obtain. Discernment is Saint Anthony says one of the most important virtues to have. Discernment was so important for Anthony, and he, one of the great examples of this is one time he was sleeping and the demons told him, "Get up and pray," and he said no. And the idea is that he was able to discern, first off, that these were the demons telling him to do something. Secondly, that even if the demons tell him to do something good, he should not do it. Third, it was probably to tire him out so that they could attack him later on. So discernment is a beautiful virtue that we'll grow to understand. I have a feeling after repentance or penitence, there's a lot of these smaller steps that we might skip, but I want you to kind of keep reading them. You can probably finish one a day. I do remember gluttony, which is an important step, and then also chastity, which I think will be very interesting to read. So I want to get at least up to chapter 16 very quickly. So just read as much as you can. Go in peace. The peace of the Lord be with you all.